Hi, everybody. My name is Melissa Leonard, and I'm the CIA Product Manager here at Gleim. We have a special treat for you today. We'll be talking with Joseph Mauriello to discuss different career paths in auditing. He is both a CIA and a CPA, and a senior lecturer, as well as the director of the Center for Internal Auditing Excellence at the University of Texas at Dallas. He is active in the local Dallas IA chapter and I believe currently hold the title of past president. Is that correct, Joseph?
I hold a lot of titles. So yeah, I'm the past president and I currently sit on the board of governors.
Okay. And some of you may recognize him as the lead CIA Gleim Instruct lecturer. So he's had experience as an external and internal auditor before becoming a professor at UT Dallas. So we're going to talk to him about both career paths there. And without further delay, let's just dig right in.
Sounds good.
All right. So Joseph, do you want to tell us a little bit about what your experience, like what led you to becoming an internal auditor or to be practicing auditing?
Well, I mean, I would say that the career path turned out to be an accident of fate for me. I wasn't even thinking I was going to end up being an auditor. I actually started my undergraduate career thinking I was going to be a lawyer. So I went the pre-law path and then realized I didn't have a passion for law school. And then basically accidentally stumbled into accounting and auditing. I stumbled into accounting by virtue of the fact that I was a tutor, and the agency I worked for at the time didn't have anybody with accounting experience, so I was literally picking up a textbook and teaching accounting to students. So I was learning it right before they did. And then when I decided to move forward with that, I learned about auditing when I started my accounting degree and fell in love with it immediately. I just liked the concept of trying to look into things and learn more about how financial statements work and ultimately how internal controls worked. I just found the entire concept fascinating, and it really stimulated the intellectual curiosity.
Nice. And how long did you practice auditing?
Well, I still consider myself an auditor today despite being in the classroom. So, if you look overall, I have roughly 18 years of experience total, 6 years in the classroom. So 12 of those years really were focused on, accounting and auditing as a whole. I even spent a 1-year stint as a controller, but we won't tell anybody that. But yeah, I spent, an initial period there doing some financial statement audit for a smaller CPA firm. I didn't get as much out of it, perhaps, as I did eventually with internal audit. But obviously, it served me well throughout my career.
Okay. And then what brought you to teaching?
Life is about relationships, right? So I was, as you said, the past president of the Dallas IIA chapter, the individual who had founded the Center for Internal Auditing Excellence at UT Dallas was a board member and was in the process of moving on from that role. He was retiring, and he approached me one day and said, hey, you've come to the classroom, you served as a guest lecturer, you've been a great leader for our chapter and the profession here locally in Dallas. The job is yours. You have to go interview for it officially, but you should go do that. And I went, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. I really just didn't picture myself in that role at that time. And of course, here we are, 6 years later. But as I said, I started, getting into the accounting profession and auditing in particular by virtue of being a tutor.
Right.
So I think it's kind of a natural progression for me.
Yeah.
And, obviously, I enjoy being in the classroom. That is something that, when I wake up in the morning, I actually look forward to it. And that
I was just going to say, it seems like it was this really great evolution. It was full circle. You started learning accounting by teaching, and now you're kind of doing that same thing and teaching others. So,
and I think, that's absolutely right. I also think it's very true about this profession that because it's a profession where whether it's external or internal audit, you have to be a lifelong learner. Of course, the best way to learn is to learn by teaching. And I think, it's kind of a reciprocal relationship. I think for me, it obviously is played a key role into how I've gotten to where I'm at.
Right. Do you want to, I mentioned that you were both an internal and an external auditor. Did you start out an external and then find your way into internal, or how did that kind of progression
Yeah, so I really didn't know anything about internal auditing at first. Back in 2001, 2002, that time frame, we were just going through the throes of, the post-Enron era, right? And, trying as a society working our way through that. So, most schools at the time really just focused on external audit. And so that's how I got my foray into that. And as I spent time in it, I went through the motions. I enjoyed the mechanics of it. I enjoyed, the interactions with friends and coworkers. But I just couldn't. I didn't feel as fulfilled as I would have liked. So I moved in from there to accounting, and I was working, oddly enough, in the mortgage-backed securities industry on the accounting side, and talk about a front row seat to history eventually. That actually led me to an internal audit role. And so I was working at a firm in the mortgage-backed securities industry doing consulting work on the accounting side. Another firm found me and said, hey, we are in the same industry. We need an auditor. We need someone who actually knows the industry. We'll teach you how to audit, even though I had audit experience. And I said, you know what, that sounds interesting. Why not? And I gave it a try, and it's the best decision I ever made. I was able to use my external audit skills there. I was able to use my accounting and business knowledge there. And I was able to build a lot of new skill sets, particularly in the areas of risk management. And as I said, it was obviously something that, paid dividends immediately for me. I took to a duck to water, right? I moved on from there. I started traveling internationally and doing international engagements. I started getting additional industry experience because I'd started in financial services. And then moved on to chemicals manufacturing, and then from there into oil and gas. So it was just kind of this amazing tour of industry, if you will, that took off from there. So, I owe a lot to my external audit background and to my accounting background in getting me there. But, again, it's about building relationships.
You kind of mentioned how when you were getting your start, it was right at that, like, the time of the Enron scandal, and
Yes.
maybe can you talk a little bit about how the profession has changed since you first got in it to where it is now?
Yeah, I think one of the things I think it's been really the hallmark of the profession is the fact that essentially the principles haven't changed, whether it's, for the folks at the CPA side of the house, the CIA side of the house, or those who kind of live in both camps, right? The principles have been there and continue to be consistent. I think what's changed in the profession is the rate of change. I think just the technology component alone just continues to escalate at a rate that I don't think we would have been able to even comprehend 20 years ago. But at its core, auditing is auditing, and you have to be able to understand the business and understand how an organization makes its money, how it spends its money. Those core things are the same. It's really tough, I think, being a student today, because you have to appreciate all those factors that maybe you and I would have gone through back in the day, but you now have to add all these other aspects to it. So I think it's increasingly challenging from that perspective. That's not to say that there aren't benefits to that, right? I think there's some gains to be had, but that's been the biggest risk or change that I've seen to the profession, and I think it'll continue to shape us moving forward.
Right. And do you believe that's really one of the most challenging parts to being an auditor, or what would you say is the most challenging part of that?
Well, for me, it's one of the reasons you get up in the morning, right? You don't get into this industry if you want the same rote schedule every day with the same routine. That's just not that's just not me anyway.
People might think that about auditing, but that's not the case, right?
It's funny how that works. No, you have to be on your toes. This is not for the meek, right? But to me, it's not the rate of change or the technology that's necessarily the most challenging part. To me, it's more the qualitative side that's a little more challenging. We forget. I mean, going back to Enron, at its core, that whole era, which we have since repeated in different forms, it's about holding folks accountable and being willing to put oneself out there. So professional courage to me is the biggest challenge that any auditor is going to go through, and they're going to go through that at different points in their career. Obviously, when you start off as a staff auditor, whether it's internal or external, there's going to be points in time where maybe you have to speak up. But of course, as you move up the ladder, that becomes exponentially more difficult. So I think that to me is the thing that auditors really have to work on as well throughout the years, but it's the one thing that certainly stands out as a consistent challenge.
Right. Okay. And what would probably be the most rewarding part, like the opposite end of the spectrum there?
Well, for me, and this is what I think I found so fulfilling in particular about internal audit. Uh, the fact that you can see that you're making a difference. I never, when I was in grad school, I never wanted to be in a position where I felt like I was just doing something just to go through the motions and just to check. So that really wasn't what I wanted to be about. It's one thing to say, well, I want to help people. I genuinely always wanted to do that, but I also wanted to make a difference and see a business progress. And it might sound corny, but to somehow leave a legacy, right? So one of the great opportunities that I've had in this profession is to be part of an organization or two or three now that you can see that progression over time, and you can see that we really make a difference. Not to mention, once you start connecting all the dots, all the different stakeholders that are involved here. I don't, and that was particularly true on the internal audit side. I don't think I appreciated it at the time on the external audit side, because the same thing exists there in terms of the public trust. But perhaps I was too young and naive at the time to appreciate that.
Well, when you were starting out, talking about that professional courage that it takes, was there any particular person or thing that happened that was just kind of inspirational to you in that track in your career?
Well, there were a lot of different things going on. I knew folks who had lost their jobs at WorldCom when WorldCom failed. And, I wasn't necessarily in grad school at the time. It would be a couple of years later, but that certainly stuck in my memory. And then I saw folks who would be affected, by downturns in the economy. My father worked for the federal government for 26 years. He, at one point, was a fraud examiner. And, great story here, just like any other parent and child, right? Parent says, I really think you should consider majoring in this or doing that. And I went, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. You did that. Why would I do that? And you kind of know what the end of the story looks like, right? I ended up doing that. So I think initially those skills, the interest really came out of watching him do his job and hearing some of the really funny war stories. He would come home and say, you're not going to believe what I did today. And so I always kind of found that to be inspirational, because I never felt like I was putting my life on the line per se with what I was doing, but there were, some stories that he would tell me that I go, okay, that sounds a lot more dangerous than maybe it should. But again, he was trying to make a difference. He was trying to do the right thing. And I gravitated towards that. But, it turned out that, I focused more on financials, right? And he, focused more on fraud in terms of governmental programs. So it was just a different venue, but he certainly served as an inspiration for me.
Wonderful. A great inspiration at that. So we have talked a little bit about external and internal, that you have experience with both. For anyone out there who's trying to decide whether they want to start in one and maybe later transition to another, or just which route they want to go, can you maybe discuss the main difference between internal and external, and how maybe some advice you may have to someone who's making that decision?
So this is funny, because it seems to be, it depends on who you talk to, right? If somebody started an external audit, more often than not, they'll say, well, of course you should start an external audit, right? Or if you started an internal, start there. I've even had folks who I've known who have gone from tax to internal and say, well, you should probably start in tax. Look at it and you're like, oh, okay, I don't know what to say. There's not a right fit for everybody. And that's kind of the, typical consulting answer, right? It depends. I think you're probably more often, likely to start in the area where you can express the most expertise. So if you're, a student at UT Dallas in my internal auditing program, you're more apt to start an internal audit, because A, you have that interest, and B, obviously we have folks recruiting for that purpose. There's a lot of benefits to starting an external. Clearly, when we think about the language of business is accounting. And being an external auditor puts you at the forefront of interpreting that language. So, deciphering the financial statements, making sure that they're fairly presented, is a meaningful skill set to have, and can't be understated. Where that pays dividends is when you become an internal auditor. If you progress from one to the other, uh, that gives you confidence in that area, while you can then expand your knowledge base to the rest of the business, because there's a lot more going on than just the financials, of course. But for those folks who start in the internal auditing path, what I've found is that they don't necessarily want to do that, right? They want to focus on those other areas. So uh, internal audit unto itself has been viewed in a lot of different ways. It could be a talent generator for an organization. It could be a place where you want to spend your entire career. And I've kind of been in organizations that take both approaches. The organizations that use it as a talent generator, though, they may look for folks who have done external audit before, because they want them to progress into accounting and financial leadership roles. So if that's your progression, right, you need to think about where you start, because you need to be able to check a few boxes, for that resume. But otherwise, I think there's transferable skills in both that certainly lend themselves well to career paths. I will say, folks who are genuinely interested in consulting, the internal audit path makes a lot of sense. And external audit, to some degree, assuming you go to a larger firm, you're going to have to spend some time in there to build those skill sets. But that time could be just as well spent maybe on the internal audit side, building your consulting skill set. So again, just like everything else, you should plan out and say, okay, this is my end game. This is the goal 5 years, 10 years from now. But what can I do in the short term to build the skill sets necessary to achieve that? So I obviously try to compel my students in the internal auditing class to pursue internal audit for obvious reasons. But I counsel and advise accounting students in our program as well as to the benefits of external audit, because half the time they'll automatically dismiss it and try to go right to accounting. And I'll say, well, let's think about this, because I think you're really missing out.
So what tips would you have? So you talk to students all the time, right? As a professor and director of the internal audit there at UT Dallas. What do you tell students or candidates that are just starting out in their career? So any of the students that are watching today, like, what would be the thing that you would tell them?
So it's, I have about 200 students this semester. So I teach 5 classes in the fall semester. And the fall semester has really kind of crystallized this question for me. I have, especially in the era of a pandemic, right? Embracing ambiguity is something that, as auditors, you have to do. Probably more so with internal audit to some extent than external audit, but the answers aren't always given to you, and there could be multiple solutions to a problem. So, for folks starting off in this career path, right, who are, starting to take these classes and starting to get into it, if you can't operate, or you have to operate, I should say, with just clearly defined boundaries or a clearly defined path, there's some of that, but not a whole lot of it, right? I mean, you're trying to build skill sets here to solve problems. That requires critical thinking. It requires the ability to apply that to situations that aren't well defined. So this is, again, not the type of job where you're going to have consistency from day to day. And so changing that mindset in the classroom is very important to get folks accustomed to that, because if you don't make that change beforehand, once you get into the proverbial real world, it's a bit of a struggle to adapt. So what I've found is, when I try to counsel students one way or the other as to how to progress in their academic career and how to progress in the classroom, you might as well embrace it now. There's no sense in postponing it. And it's very free in a sense too, because you start to look at the world a little bit differently. And that's a big challenge. I mean, it's a hurdle to get over, and every auditor does it. But the earlier you come to terms with that, the more comfortable students will be.
Okay. All right. What predictions or thoughts do you have about the auditing profession for the near future? And then maybe, yeah.
I was going to say, I feel like I should get my hat on and be here.
Yeah, I mean, you've been in the profession for a while. As we talked about, we've seen like changes, and you've kind of touched on the technology side and everything that's been kind of changing. But like, what do you see What predictions do you have for it for, the near future, but even further out, if you're going to take a look down?
Well, I think if anybody picks up, one of the magazines or periodicals in the professions, the thing they see right now is that the robots are taking over, and that it's going to look like iRobot in the next 10 years or whatever movie that was. I don't necessarily see that exactly being the case. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, the rate of change of technology has been a driver and will continue to be. We're seeing right now, and this is true for both the CPA and the CIA side of the house, this movement towards the new integrated auditor, which this concept's not new in reality, but what that really means is the internal audit view is taking hold, I would say, where we're integrating the controls and process piece with the technology auditor. We used to actually classify somebody as an IT auditor, and that's really not happening anymore. We'd have IT auditors on the financial statement side. We have IT auditors on the internal audit side. It's very hard to move in the profession now if you don't have those technology audit skills. So for use of a better term, we'll call that the advent of the integrated auditor. And that's going to continue on both sides. We see the CPA exam reshaping itself here to reflect this. And that'll be the case in a few years for sure. The CIA is doing the same thing. So it's not an accident. And I think what it's doing is it's reflecting what's going on in the profession, right? We're seeing the rise of data analytics a bit more, especially with data, which they haven't really brought into the accounting fold per se before, but it's certainly been in existence for some time. We've seen the growth in robotic process automation, but all of this requires auditors to have a baseline knowledge in technology risk. And I think that'll be continued to be reflected in the certifications and the licenses. I think it'll be reflected in continuing professional ed moving forward. For me, having been in this profession, we'll call it nearly 20 years now, it just seems like we've been continuously moving down this path. So it's not that the concepts are really new. It's just that they took a different form. I remember when all of a sudden, tools like ACL and IDEA were cutting edge, right? And they still are, but now we've moved on to much more advanced analytics tools. And Teammate and work paper software was a big deal 20 years ago. Now we've expanded upon that and created entire GRC suites, right? So I think we're going to continue to build upon that. Conceptually, that should free up resources, whether you're an external auditor or an internal auditor. What it does do, and this is going back to the challenge it creates for students, is the expectations as a first-year auditor have changed. It's not that you can just know accounting or internal controls and be safe. Now you have to be conversant in so many other areas that maybe a staff auditor 20 years ago wouldn't have to be. So that creates new expectations and new challenges, but it also creates new opportunities. At its simplest form, though, having robotic process automation remove some of the otherwise so-called mundane tasks that the auditor may have to do so that they can do more advanced auditing. Well, in the past, if you were a staff auditor, you had a chance to learn some of those more mundane tasks in order to become an advanced auditor. So I think that's the progression. The rate of change for an individual auditor is really predicated not just on the technology, but the fact that you have to know more quickly in order to be successful. So I don't think it's a bad thing as a whole, but it's certainly going to be a challenge.
Well, we are a review course provider, and you are our lead Gleim CIA instructor. So, and I'm going to ask this question because you're a CPA and a CIA. Do you have tips for exam candidates, for people who are sitting for or planning to sit for any certification exam, but mainly the CIA or the CPA exam?
Sure. I mean, obviously, when you're pursuing a license or pursuing a certification like this, you're pursuing the standard within that profession. And so, to not take it seriously is it's a discredit to not only the profession, but also to, your efforts within your career. So you have to take it seriously. You have to put the time in. And I think folks who, really appreciate that are obviously the folks who have gotten through it. You'll talk to folks who are CPAs and you'll hear the war stories of, hey, I put in my 3 months or 6 months of time to really get all 4 parts knocked out. And you know, it's anybody who's pursuing this at this point in time, you've probably got further along in your accounting career. You've put in the time to master the basic concepts. So really the CPA or the CIA at that point is icing on the cake. To not go the extra mile is really a disservice, I think. So, those who are taking this step, and, I hear from candidates all the time, and enjoy the interactions. The two big things I hear is, I just don't feel like I have the time, and it just seems overwhelming. So the time thing, we can schedule that, right? You can plan out your schedule, and Gleim's team, the consultants do a really good job helping folks and advising folks. The overwhelming part is part of the maturation process, unfortunately. Going back to embracing ambiguity, right? I tell folks, look, treat it like you would an audit. What are the riskiest parts? If you look at the content outline, Gleim does a really good job of pointing out the areas where you should probably be focusing your time. And just realize that, the exams are, they're difficult for a reason, right? If they weren't worth pursuing, then everyone would just pass it and it wouldn't be that big a deal. But these are things worth doing, and anything worth doing requires the time and the effort. As someone with 8 certifications under my belt, for a variety of different reasons, the first 2 I got were the CPA and the CIA, and those are the 2 that, frankly, I probably cherish the most, because they really are what set me up for my career subsequently. And they both required time and effort. And it seems too simple, but it really is that simple.
And we know for the CPA, a lot of times, especially if you're going to go work for a firm or do some public accounting, you have to have the CPA, right?
Absolutely.
And
I mean, moving up in an accounting firm, depending on which discipline you're in, you're going to have to be certified in something. But if you're going to do public accounting, the reality is the CPA is, of course, the gold standard, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Right. And I know some employers may not require the CIA, but my feeling, my opinion, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that having that CIA, if you're going to enter into internal audit or go to an employer and you can show that you have that credential, how important is that going to be to an employer, whether or not they actually require it for their employees?
Well, I think for employers that obviously take internal audit seriously, right? That go through the process of doing their quality assessments on a 5-year basis, that they want to show that they comply with the IIA's competency model. They're going to pursue folks who model the standard, right? So they're going to look for folks who have that certification, and rightfully so. They're looking for internal auditing expertise, and that's the hallmark of it. I equate, and this is true for really both camps, CPA and CIA, but another way of looking at it is picture, you go through law school for 3 years, right? And then you just decide, I'm not going to take the bar exam.
Right.
I'm not going to be allowed to practice law, in front of the court or whatever in a particular state. That's almost what I equated to. It's like, no, you've gone through this. You need to do this. You need to distinguish yourself. The story that, for folks who enter into public accounting in particular, but industry as well, you'll see this story in your career at some point, right? The folks who don't get the certifications done earlier, right? We always talk about, hey, the longer you wait, the tougher it is, right, after school. And that's very true. But there's no worse feeling than, progressing in your career, not having done the certifications, only to realize that you hit a ceiling. And, whether we want to admit to the reality or not, that happens. Certainly true in public accounting, as you already indicated, getting the CPA, but on the industry side, right? If you're doing internal audit from an industry perspective, let's not kid ourselves. What are they looking for? What are audit committees looking for who take internal audit seriously? They're looking for the CIA, and they're looking for experience. It just seems like a no-brainer to me. Again, waiting is tough.
And as you mentioned, when you're giving advice for exam candidates, the work that has to go into pursuing these certifications, that also shows to your employers that you are willing to take that extra effort to be a lifelong learner or to continue on with your professional development, and just kind of, I think, helps further that perception. of
Oh,
yourself?
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, first of all, to that point, we encourage our students to start pursuing the certifications while they're in my classes. And inevitably, they'll show that on their resumes. And when recruiting starts, the recruiting season start, employers look at that and they go, okay, here's somebody who takes this seriously, right? And, obviously you get 5, 6, 7 years into your career. If you've been doing internal auditing that whole time or external auditing that whole time, and you can't show that you've made that next step, rightly or wrongly, the employer may look at that and go, okay, this is a red flag. I don't know why this individual hasn't pursued this if they're supposedly taking this career seriously. Uh, and I think you're absolutely right. It shows the commitment one has to the profession, which clearly, it's meaningful, and it's meaningful to those who have achieved that hallmark.
Right.
Uh, let's not kid ourselves; they're looking for it.
Hmm. Absolutely. Okay, well, wrapping this up, one last question for you is, what makes you auditor proud?
I I am auditor proud because I'm fortunate enough to have been part of a profession that can make a difference, and I felt like I've been able to make a difference in my career. So uh, that's why I'm auditor proud, and that's true again for both disciplines, external audit and internal audit. I thoroughly enjoy uh, the minutia of working through the processes, this systematic, disciplined approach that we do in auditing, uh, because the outcomes can affect lives. And during good times we may not realize that, but during economic struggles, during pandemics, our role as risk management professionals plays an outsized role. So to me, I'm auditor proud because we make a difference.
Great. Well, it has been so great catching up with you, Joseph. I haven't seen as much of you this year, with this all being virtual now. So it's just been great to see you and catch up. And hopefully, I think everyone here can get a little glimpse of, especially those trying to decide what path to choose, or maybe showing them that they don't have to necessarily choose one path and it be the end all be all. Like, they have options in their career with auditing. So,
They need to embrace the ambiguity and
exactly.
just do it. But Melissa, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And I, best of luck to you and your family. Wish you guys all well.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you.